Daughter, the deep, familiar voice came from the conference room doorway, cutting through the tension that had left everyone struggling to breathe. Every person in the room turned. Thomas Whitmore stepped inside with calm, measured authority. In his position, he did not need to raise his voice or hurry to command attention. "Mr. Whitmore," several employees murmured. Others rose from their chairs out of habit. His eyes passed over the torn contract scattered across the floor. One piece still carried the name Carter Safe Signal. Another fragment revealed part of the figure Richard Hale had contemptuously dismissed only moments earlier. "Wu Bai went Meiyuan." Only then did Thomas look at Richard. The color drained from the CEO's face. "Mr. Whitmore," Richard said, quickly straightening his jacket. "I wasn't informed you would be here today. We were discussing concerns about this supplier's qualifications." Thomas did not acknowledge him. He walked directly to Annie. "Are you all right?" His voice softened as he studied her face. He adjusted the collar of her navy jacket, a small gesture that belonged to a father rather than a billionaire. "What happened?" Annie held several torn pages against her chest. Her hands remained steady, but Thomas noticed the tension in her jaw. "Mr. Hale canceled the Carter Beacon project," she said. "He accused me of stealing the design." Thomas looked down at the paper. "The contract you worked so hard on?" "Yes, Dad, but he tore it apart without even reviewing it." Richard stepped forward. "Sir, there are serious problems with this proposal. I was protecting the company from a potentially fraudulent agreement." Thomas turned. "Did you review the independent test results?" Richard hesitated and moved half a step backward. A thin line of sweat appeared across his forehead. "Chairman, I mean. Sir, Miss Carter is very young. I was concerned about the risk of assigning a project this large to someone without enough experience." "Without enough experience?" Thomas repeated. "Did you fail to read the file, or did you choose to ignore it for another reason?" "I reviewed enough to identify several concerns." "That was not my question." The room fell silent. Richard cleared his throat. "I had not completed the entire review." "Did you call the Philadelphia Fire Department to confirm its approval?" "No, but..." "Did you contact the engineers whose signatures appear in the certification file?" "No." "Did you review the 12-building pilot program?" Richard tightened his mouth. "Not personally." Thomas turned toward Maya Rodriguez, the contract analyst standing near the end of the table. "Miss Rodriguez, did this proposal go through the company's standard review process?" Maya glanced at Richard before answering. "Yes, sir. The technical submissions were anonymous during scoring. Carter Safe Signal received the highest overall score." "And legal approved the agreement?" "Yes, sir." Richard lifted a hand. "The process was flawed. No one told me this company was run by a girl this young." Annie looked directly at him. "My age was listed in the compliance documents. After the technical review," Richard said, "convenient. My identity was withheld for the same reason every applicant's identity was withheld. The proposals were supposed to be judged on the work." Richard gave a restrained laugh. "You expect this company to believe you created an entire public safety system alone?" "I never said I worked without help." "That sounds like an admission." "That is how engineering works," Annie replied. "I developed the prototype and the system architecture. Licensed engineers reviewed the electrical design. An independent laboratory conducted the tests. Approved contractors would handle installation." Richard turned toward Thomas as if she had proved his argument. "There. She admits other people performed the important work." Thomas studied him. "When you had heart surgery 3 years ago, did one person conduct every test, prepare every instrument, administer every drug, and monitor every machine?" Richard said nothing. "Did that mean your surgeon stole the operation?" Several employees lowered their eyes. Richard's voice cooled. "This has nothing to do with her race or age." "No one mentioned race," Thomas said. The silence after those words changed the room. Richard glanced toward the door, then back at Annie. "I said she lacks experience. Thousands of residents may depend on this system. A moving story about her father does not qualify her to carry that responsibility." Thomas's expression hardened. Annie placed the torn pages on the table. "My father was not part of the technical proposal, but he was a firefighter," Richard replied. "His death gives the product emotional value. That may have influenced the review. You just admitted you did not read the proposal." Richard stopped. "If you had," Annie continued, "you would know my father's name appears once, on the final page of the founder's statement. The scoring panel never received that page." Richard turned to Thomas. Sir, even if she is personally connected to you, I still have the right to question her. He leaned toward Annie. Then explain why a girl like you believes she understands building safety better than professionals who have spent decades in the field. Thomas shifted forward, but Annie raised a hand. Dad, let me answer. He stopped. My father inspected old apartment buildings, she said. He often came home angry because the people living there were always told upgrades cost too much. Richard folded his arms. So you built this device because of something he said? I started asking questions because of what he said. What questions? Why older buildings were so difficult to upgrade. Why maintenance reports could be filed without proof that equipment had been checked. Why residents who did not speak English well received instructions they could not understand. Her voice remained quiet. My father said, a safety device is only useful when ordinary families can afford to use it. After he died, I kept asking those questions. Thomas watched her without interrupting. I built the first prototype when I was 14, Annie continued. It failed. The second failed differently. Helen Brooks helped me find engineers who explained what I was doing wrong, instead of doing the work for me. The laboratory rejected 2 early versions. I corrected them. The fire department requested changes. I made them. Richard looked at the Carter Beacon unit on the table. And now you believe that makes you responsible for 18,000 apartments? No. My company is responsible for supplying the system. Licensed contractors are responsible for installing it. Inspectors are responsible for code compliance. Your property teams are responsible for maintenance. Annie placed one finger on the folder Richard had ignored. And you were responsible for reading the evidence before deciding none of us had done our jobs. Richard narrowed his eyes. You do not speak to the CEO of this company that way. She asked you to read a report, Maya said. Richard turned sharply. I did not ask for your opinion. Maya's face tightened, but she remained standing. The agreement was approved, she said. You asked me whether it was valid. I told you it was. Richard looked around the room and seemed to realize the silence no longer belonged to him. He pointed at Annie. She concealed her relationship with the chairman. That alone justifies suspending the agreement. Thomas answered before Annie could. Our relationship was disclosed to legal. Richard blinked. She is your daughter? Yes. Your biological daughter? My daughter, Thomas repeated. That is the only answer you require. Richard looked at Annie as though seeing her for the first time. Then his eyes dropped to the folders on the table. For one brief second, the contempt left his face. Richard was the first to recover. He planted both hands on the table, gripping its edge as if he needed it to remain standing. If that relationship was disclosed, I was never informed. You weren't supposed to be, Maya said. The disclosure was sealed during the technical scoring process. Richard turned toward her. You seem unusually eager to defend this contract. I'm explaining the process. No, he replied. You're choosing a side. Thomas started to speak, but Annie touched his sleeve. Let him finish. Richard looked at her, some of his confidence returning. He had finally found a way to move the discussion away from the files he had refused to read. A company founded by the chairman's daughter receives a $5 million contract, he said. Then the chairman appears minutes after I question it. We cannot simply ignore that. I didn't call my father, Annie said. Richard faced Thomas. Then why are you here? My meeting ended early. How convenient. Thomas stepped toward him. Choose your next words carefully, Richard. Annie moved between them before the warning could become something more serious. He's right about one thing, she said. The relationship should be reviewed. Thomas looked at her. Annie, legal already cleared it. I know. But everyone here heard the accusation. Unless we answer it properly, that suspicion will follow the project into every building where the system is installed. Richard nodded at once. Then the contract must be suspended. Preserved? Annie corrected. Not cancelled. No files altered, no vendor replaced, and no documents removed until an independent review is complete. You don't set the terms. No, Annie said calmly, but I have the right to ask that every piece of evidence remain intact. Thomas looked toward Maya. Who heads the Independent Compliance Committee? Evelyn Parker. She reports directly to the board. Call her. Richard stepped forward. We do not need independent counsel for a supplier dispute. Thomas gave him his full attention. 5 minutes ago, you called it possible fraud. Now it is a supplier dispute. Which version would you like entered into the record? Richard fell silent. Maya reached for the conference room phone. Thomas turned back to Annie. Sit down. I'm Fina. Several employees looked away, hiding the small changes in their expressions. For the first time, the man before them was not Thomas Whitmore, chairman of a real estate empire. He was simply a father watching his daughter hold herself together. If you feel for Annie, a young woman forced to defend years of hard work after being judged before anyone even opened her files, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because someone near you may be listening to Annie's story at this very moment. Annie sat. Thomas pulled a chair beside her rather than taking the place at the head of the table. Richard noticed. Do you intend to participate in the review? No, Thomas said. I intend to remove myself from it. The answer surprised everyone, including Annie. My relationship with Annie creates the appearance of a conflict, even though it had no influence on the scoring. I will not vote, direct witnesses, or review confidential evidence. Richard's shoulders loosened. Then Thomas added, but I will make certain the board knows exactly how its chief executive treated a qualified contractor before reading even one page of her work. Richard's relief disappeared. Maya set down the phone. Miss Parker can be here within 40 minutes. She asked that no one leave the room with company records. Richard's eyes moved toward the leather briefcase beside his chair. Annie saw it. Thomas did too. Is there something in that case related to this project? Annie asked. Richard withdrew his hand from the handle. Executive materials. Then they can remain in the room, Maya said. Richard stared at her. You are testing the limits of your position. Maya swallowed but held his gaze. I'm following a preservation request. You dare. It appears judgment is not your only problem today, Thomas said. His voice was low, each word controlled. You are behaving like a man with something to hide. You misunderstand me, sir. I am protecting confidential company information. Then make certain the secret you're protecting can survive an independent review. Thomas sat beside Annie. Tell me what happened before I arrived. You heard the important part. I heard the end. Annie looked around the table. I came to complete the final authorization. Mr. Hale asked where the chief engineer was. When Maya introduced me, he thought she was joking. That is not accurate, Richard said. You asked whether I was an intern. You looked like one. The words escaped before he could stop them. Annie nodded once. Then you asked who had really designed Carter Beacon. I gave you the certification file. You didn't open it. Richard looked toward Thomas. She expected me to accept an extraordinary claim without examination. I expected you to examine it, Annie replied. That is why I brought 4 binders. Thomas looked at the unopened files. What did you bring besides the test results? Pilot data, licensing records, the installation plan, liability insurance, and the deployment list. The list you asked him to read? Yes. Thomas picked it up. Why is this list so important? Annie opened the folder. Because these are not just properties. They're people's homes. She turned it toward him. Jefferson Courts has 684 apartments. More than a third of the residents are over 60. Franklin Terrace has families who speak 7 primary languages. At Rosewood Towers, residents with hearing loss have requested visual alerts for 4 years. Richard folded his arms. The company already has safety systems. Carter Beacon does not replace them, Annie said. It creates a verifiable record showing when supplemental devices are tested, disconnected, or overdue for maintenance. Richard's eyes shifted toward the folder. Annie saw the fear again. Thomas followed her gaze. Why do the maintenance records concern you? They don't, Richard answered too quickly. My concern is liability. Then why did you remove the maintenance appendix from last week's board packet? Maya asked. Richard turned slowly toward her. Annie stared at Maya. He removed it? Maya hesitated. Until now, she had answered only direct questions. This time she had chosen to step beyond procedure. I uploaded the complete technical file on Thursday. By Friday morning, Appendix D was missing from the executive version. What was in Appendix D? Thomas asked. Annie answered without looking away from Richard. A comparison between our pilot data and the company's existing maintenance records. Thomas waited. The numbers did not match. Richard pushed his chair away. This meeting is over until counsel arrives. No, Thomas said. It is paused. Richard picked up his briefcase. Maya moved closer to the door. She did not block him, but her meaning was clear. Miss Parker asked that all company materials remain here. I am still the chief executive, and I am still the chairman, Thomas said. Put the case down. Richard remained motionless for several seconds. Then he set it on the table. The lock struck the polished wood with a hard click. The contract had taken Richard only seconds to destroy. Annie's files contained discrepancies stretching across nearly a decade. For the first time that morning, she understood that he had not been trying only to humiliate her. He had been trying to stop Carter Beacon from ever being installed. The briefcase remained on the table between Richard and the door. No one touched it. Maya returned to her chair, though she stayed near the aisle. Thomas sat beside Annie, his hands folded in front of him. He had removed himself from the coming review, but his presence still changed how everyone in the room breathed. Richard looked at the clock. 40 minutes is an unreasonable delay. I have another meeting. You can reschedule it, Thomas said. I have obligations to this company. So does everyone else in this room. Richard's eyes moved toward Annie. This entire interruption began because a supplier refused to accept a routine executive decision. You tore a signed contract, Annie said. I rejected a questionable agreement. You destroyed the paper after legal had approved it. Richard's jaw tightened. You are very comfortable speaking as though the outcome has already been decided. No, I'm speaking as someone who wants the evidence preserved before you decide what the outcome should be. Maya's computer chimed. She looked at the screen, then sat straighter. What is it? Thomas asked. An automated notice from compliance. The legal hold is active. Richard turned toward her. On whose authority? Evelyn Parker's. It covers all records connected to Carter Safe Signal, Creston Safety Services, and the maintenance review. The last name changed his expression. Annie noticed. Creston was not part of the contract I brought today. Maya kept her eyes on the message. It was named in Appendix D. Richard stepped toward her laptop. Close that file. Maya's hand remained on the keyboard. The system has already restricted deletion and external transfer. I said close it. Thomas did not raise his voice. Sit down, Richard. For several seconds, Richard did not move. Then he returned to his chair, but he did not sit. He rested one hand on its back and looked at the faces around the table as though calculating which of them still belonged to him. Annie took out her phone. Who are you calling? He asked. My technical advisor. You are not authorized to discuss internal company records. She helped prepare the pilot report. She already knows what is in it. Richard looked toward Thomas. This is exactly the problem. People are being brought into a confidential matter before counsel arrives. Thomas glanced at Annie. Make the call. Annie dialed Helen Brooks. Helen answered on the third ring. You're supposed to be signing a contract. That didn't happen. There was a pause. What did happen? Annie looked at the torn pages. The CEO accused me of stealing the design and tore the agreement. Helen's answer came without surprise. Did he read the test file? No. The fire department approval? No. The pilot data? No. He read your face and decided it was enough. Richard heard her through the speaker. Miss Brooks, you should understand that this project is under formal review. Then you must be Richard Hale. His face hardened. And you are? The woman who rejected Annie's third prototype because the backup power failed after 6 hours. Annie closed her eyes briefly. It was 7. It was 6 hours and 43 minutes. That still counts as 6. Thomas almost smiled. Helen continued. I also made her rebuild the signal controller, replace 2 suppliers, and repeat the environmental tests. If you want someone who handed that girl an easy approval, you called the wrong person. I did not call you, Richard said. No, Annie did, because she knows the difference between being challenged and being dismissed. Annie leaned closer to the phone. Helen, Appendix D was removed from the executive packet. The other end went quiet. When? Maya uploaded it Thursday. It was missing Friday morning. Has anyone altered the source data? Compliance just placed it under legal hold. Good. Do not send me anything new. Do not copy files. Do not let anyone turn this into an argument about personality. The original pilot records are already stored with the lab in the city. Richard spoke before Annie could respond. You seem very certain the records support her. I am certain records support themselves when people leave them alone. Helen's tone softened when she addressed Annie again. Are you staying? Annie looked at Thomas, then at Maya. Near the wall, 2 employees who had witnessed the contract being torn remained in their seats, waiting to be interviewed. Samuel Reed stood outside the glass door, his posture straight, his hands clasped in front of him. I'm staying. Good. I nearly left. I know. How? Because you always think walking away quietly proves no one managed to hurt you. Annie said nothing. Helen continued. Your father used to do the same thing. He would come home from a meeting angry enough to wear a path through the kitchen, then claim he was fine. Thomas looked down at his hands. Annie asked, what did he do after that? He went back the next morning with better notes. Richard exhaled sharply. Can we avoid turning a corporate review into a family remembrance? Helen answered before Annie could. Her father spent years teaching tenants what questions to ask about building safety. His notes are one reason she knew where to look. That is relevant whether it makes you uncomfortable or not. A knock sounded at the door. A woman in a gray suit entered, carrying a narrow leather portfolio. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with reading glasses in one hand and an expression that did not change when she saw Thomas. Evelyn Parker, she said. Independent counsel to the board. Everyone began speaking at once. Evelyn raised one hand. No. The room stopped. She placed her portfolio on the table. From this moment forward, no one deletes, edits, forwards, or removes a record connected to the Carter Safe Signal selection, the maintenance comparison, or Creston Safety Services. I will interview each witness separately. Richard straightened. As CEO, I should brief you first. You will be interviewed in the same order as everyone else. I have executive privilege over certain materials. You have obligations, not ownership. Thomas stood. Miss Parker, I have recused myself. I received the notice. I will leave if required. You may remain long enough to confirm the recusal on the record. After that, you will receive only the information provided to the rest of the board. Thomas nodded. Evelyn turned to Annie. Miss Carter, do you still have the original records you brought today? Yes. Were they in your possession when the contract was torn? Yes. Did anyone attempt to take them? Mr. Hale ordered the materials collected. They were not removed. Evelyn looked toward the unopened binders, then at the pieces of paper on the floor. Do not throw those away. Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. They are pieces of a contract, not evidence of a crime. Evelyn met his eyes. At this stage, Mr. Hale, you do not get to decide what matters. She asked Maya to provide the access history for Appendix D. Maya opened the audit log. The room watched as a line of entries appeared on the screen. Thursday afternoon, Maya had uploaded the complete packet. Friday morning, a senior executive account had opened it. 7 minutes later, Appendix D had been removed from the version prepared for the board. Evelyn leaned closer. Whose account? Maya read the name twice before speaking. Richard Hale. No one turned toward him immediately. They did not need to. Richard released the back of the chair and sat down at last. Annie rested one hand on her father's notebook inside her open backpack. She had stayed because 312 buildings were waiting for an answer. Now she understood the answer would require more than proving Carter Beacon worked. They would have to discover why Richard Hale had been so determined to keep anyone from seeing what it recorded. Evelyn studied the audit log without changing her expression. Mr. Hale, did you remove Appendix D from the board packet? Richard adjusted his cuffs. I reviewed the material and determined that the appendix was outside the scope of the vendor decision. That is not what I asked. I removed it from the executive packet. Did anyone authorize you to do so? As CEO, I have authority over the materials presented to the board. Thomas stood beside Annie's chair. You have authority to organize a meeting, Richard. You do not have authority to hide information from the board. Richard's attention shifted to him. You said you were recusing yourself. I am. That does not prevent me from understanding the rules of the company I founded. Evelyn closed Maya's laptop halfway. Mr. Whitmore, I need your recusal confirmed before we continue. Thomas nodded. I will not participate in the investigation, vote on the contract, or receive confidential updates unavailable to the rest of the board. Will you contact witnesses? No. Will you direct company employees to assist Miss Carter? No. Annie glanced at him. The answer came quickly, but she knew what it cost him. Thomas had built Whitmore Residential Group from 6 apartment buildings and a borrowed office above a hardware store. Stepping back did not come naturally to him, especially when someone had hurt his daughter. Evelyn turned to Annie. Are those conditions acceptable to you? They are necessary. Thomas looked at her. I'll be downstairs. Dad. I know, beside you, not in front of you. He picked up his coat, then paused near the torn contract. Miss Parker, I assume those pieces remain protected. They do. Thomas looked at Richard once, without speaking, and left the room. The door closed behind him. The atmosphere changed at once. Thomas's authority had filled the room, but Evelyn's control was narrower and harder to challenge. She moved the employees into separate offices and instructed security to keep the conference room closed. Richard was taken to a room across the hall with his briefcase left behind. Maya gathered her laptop. "Should I bring the original scoring files?" "Only through the internal system," Evelyn said. "Do not copy them to a personal drive." "I wouldn't. I am not accusing you. I am making the rule clear enough that no one can claim later that it was misunderstood." Maya nodded and left with a compliance officer. Evelyn sat across from Annie. The torn pages remained between them in a transparent evidence sleeve. "Start with the contract," she said. "How did Carter's safe signal enter the bidding process?" "We responded to the public request for proposals 4 months ago." "Did Thomas Whitmore tell you about it?" "No. Helen Brooks forwarded the notice to me. She received city and housing, safety bulletins." "Did Mr. Whitmore provide money for the proposal?" "No." "Office space?" "No." "Employees?" "No." "Legal support?" Annie hesitated. "The company uses a small law firm in West Philadelphia. Thomas introduced me to one of the partners 2 years ago, but Carter's safe signal pays its own bills." Evelyn wrote it down. "That distinction matters. Do not make your answers cleaner than the truth." "I'm not trying to." "Good. Clean answers often become unreliable answers." She asked Annie to explain the ownership of Carter Beacon. Annie described the prototype she had built at 14, the grant from a youth engineering foundation, the state innovation prize that funded laboratory testing, and the community bank loan secured after the pilot program. She named every engineer who had reviewed the system and explained which parts each person had examined. Evelyn stopped her. "Did any of them contribute patentable work?" "Not according to the agreements, but I want you to verify that independently." "You are comfortable having the ownership challenged?" "No," Annie said. "I'm comfortable having it checked." That answer made Evelyn look up. Annie continued. "If the system only survives because no one asks hard questions, it shouldn't be installed in anyone's home." Evelyn placed her pen down. "Tell me about your father." Annie's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. "What does he have to do with the investigation?" Richard Hale raised the possibility that your father's history influenced the award. I need to establish what the technical panel knew. They knew nothing about him. I still need the record." Annie looked toward the closed door. "My father was Daniel Carter. He served with the Philadelphia Fire Department. He also volunteered at tenant meetings in older apartment buildings." "What did he teach you?" "He taught me that safety plans are usually written by people who know where every exit is. The people most at risk are often the ones who were never invited into the room." Evelyn waited. "He used to bring home maintenance handouts," Annie said. "Some were written only in English, even when half the residents spoke another language. Some buildings had elderly tenants who couldn't hear standard alerts clearly. He would say the equipment wasn't the only problem. The system had been designed without asking who actually lived there." "Did he design Carter Beacon?" "No." "Did he leave you technical plans?" "No." "Did Thomas Whitmore?" "No." "Then why did you begin building it?" Annie looked at the Carter Beacon unit on the far end of the table. "Because my father once told me a safety device is only useful when ordinary families can afford to use it. After he died, I wanted to know why the least expensive buildings often had the least transparent maintenance records." Evelyn wrote for several seconds. "How did Thomas become your legal father?" Annie's gaze returned to her. "My father saved his life. I know the public version. I am asking for yours. Thomas offered to create a trust after my father died. I told him no. You were 12. I understood what he was trying to do." "What was that?" "Turn gratitude into a payment." Evelyn's face softened, though her tone did not. "And later? He kept visiting. He spoke with my social worker. He came to school meetings. He learned how I took my coffee before I was old enough to drink it. Eventually, he stopped behaving like a man settling a debt." "And became your father?" "Yes." "Did you disclose that relationship during bidding?" "I completed the conflict form. It was filed under restricted review so the technical panel would not see my identity." Evelyn opened another document on her tablet. "Legal confirms it was filed 12 weeks ago." Annie released a breath she had not realized she was holding. A knock came at the door. A compliance officer entered and handed Evelyn a printed access report. Evelyn read the first page, then the second. What is it? Annie asked. Richard did more than remove Appendix D. She turned the report around. The system log showed that his account had opened Carter Safe Signal's sealed conflict disclosure 3 days before the contract meeting. Annie stared at the date. He knew. Yes, he knew I was Thomas's daughter before I walked into this room. Evelyn placed the report beside the torn contract, and yet he pretended to discover it only after Mr. Whitmore arrived. Through the glass wall, Richard sat alone in the room across the hall. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the closed briefcase he had been forced to leave behind. Annie had believed his contempt came from seeing a young black woman where he expected an older man. Now she understood he had known exactly who she was. The question was no longer why Richard had misjudged her. It was why he had planned to humiliate her anyway. Evelyn did not allow Annie to confront Richard. She placed the access report inside her portfolio and asked the compliance officer to bring him into a separate interview room. You should hear his explanation, Annie said. You will read the relevant statement when I release it. Right now, I need his answers to belong to him, not to your reaction. Annie understood the logic, though she did not like it. What happens to the contract? It remains frozen, not cancelled. No replacement vendor can be selected while the legal hold is active. And the installation schedule? Delayed. That single word carried more weight than the $5 million figure printed on the torn pages. Annie thought of Jefferson Courts, Franklin Terrace, and Rosewood Towers. The names had been rows in a spreadsheet when she first received them. After the pilot meetings, they had become faces. Mrs. Green asking whether the visual signal could be seen from a hallway, a retired machinist worried about losing power during winter. Parents who needed alerts in Spanish, Mandarin, or Vietnamese. How long? Annie asked. I don't know yet. Those buildings have already waited. Evelyn closed her portfolio. Then help me conduct a review that will survive every challenge Richard's attorneys raise later. Annie nodded. What do you need? A complete source history for Carter Beacon, your financing records, and every communication with Whitmore Residential Group. I also need a written account of today while the details are fresh. I can have it by this afternoon. Tomorrow morning is sufficient. I'd rather do it today. Evelyn studied her for a moment. Your father taught you to take notes? He said memory becomes generous to people who have something to hide. That sounds like a firefighter. He usually said it about landlords. For the first time, Evelyn smiled. A compliance officer escorted Annie to a private office, 2 floors below. Thomas was waiting outside with 2 paper cups from the lobby cafe. He offered her one. Tea, he said. No coffee on an empty stomach. You remembered. I remember everything you pretend I don't notice. They sat on a bench near the windows. Market Street moved below them, buses stopping at the curb while pedestrians crossed between office towers. Thomas waited until the compliance officer walked away. What did Evelyn find? I can't discuss evidence she hasn't released. His eyebrows lifted. You learned that sentence quickly. She was clear. Thomas handed her the tea. Then tell me what you are allowed to tell me. Annie wrapped both hands around the cup. Richard accessed my sealed conflict disclosure 3 days before the meeting. Thomas's face hardened. So he knew who you were? Yes. And still acted surprised when I called you my daughter? Yes. Thomas stood. Annie caught his wrist. Where are you going? To speak with the board. You recused yourself. I can still demand that Richard be removed from the building. That would be directing the investigation. He planned this. We don't know everything he planned. We know enough. Annie released his wrist. That is exactly what Richard said before he tore the contract. Thomas looked at her. He said he had seen enough, she continued. He decided what the truth was before reading the evidence. I don't want us to become more powerful versions of him. Thomas sat again, though every movement showed resistance. I am not Richard Hale. No, but you're angry, and angry people often believe their reasons make them accurate. He looked down at the cup in his hand. Daniel used to talk to me like that. Annie turned toward him. You never told me. He did not soften his opinions for men with money. What did he say? Thomas leaned back against the wall. The first time we met, I was visiting one of our older properties. I arrived in a suit with 6 people carrying folders. Your father was leading a tenant safety meeting in the community room. You interrupted him. I introduced myself. You interrupted him politely. Thomas gave a quiet laugh. He asked whether I had come to listen or to have my photograph taken. That sounds like Dad. I told him I own the building. What did he say? He said ownership was not the same as understanding what happened inside it. Annie stared through the window. Thomas continued. He walked me through every floor. He knew which residents used walkers, which families needed translated notices, and which doors were difficult for older tenants to open. I knew the occupancy rate and operating cost. Daniel knew the people. That's why you started the resident advisory program. That is why I claimed I started it. Annie looked back at him. The truth is less flattering, Thomas said. Your father embarrassed me into it. He would have considered that a successful meeting. Thomas smiled, but it faded quickly. After he died, I thought writing a check was the honorable response. I knew how to fund scholarships and create trusts. Those were problems I understood, and I refused. You looked at an amount that could have changed your life and told me I was insulting your father. I didn't say insulting. You were 12, Annie. Your face said the rest. She lowered her eyes to the tea. Thomas continued. You said his work was sacred, and I should not use money to turn it into a debt. I went home angry with you. You never told me that either. I was angry because you were right. The elevator doors opened down the hall. Maya stepped out with her laptop held against her chest. She stopped when she saw them. Miss Parker asked me to bring Miss Carter back upstairs. Annie stood. Did something happen? Maya glanced toward Thomas, then remembered the recusal. I'm not permitted to discuss it here. Thomas nodded. You're learning the sentence too. Maya did not smile. Her face was pale. Annie moved closer. Are you all right? I'm not sure. What did Richard say to you? Maya tightened her grip on the laptop. Before today, he asked me to prepare a summary stating that your company lacked adequate leadership experience. Before he met me? 2 days before. Annie felt the corridor narrow around her. Did you write it? I drafted what he requested, then I reviewed the scoring records and refused to sign it. Thomas stood but said nothing. Maya continued. He told me executive decisions did not require my agreement. This morning, he asked me to bring only the contract and the founder's statement into the meeting. Not the test data? Annie asked. No. The licensing records? No. Appendix D? Maya shook her head. Especially not Appendix D. The elevator chimed behind them. Annie looked at Thomas. He understood what she was about to say before she spoke. Stay here. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. Annie entered the elevator with Maya. As the doors began to close, Thomas said, I'll be beside you. Annie met his eyes. Then let me speak first. The doors closed between them. Maya pressed the button for the 34th floor. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Annie asked, Why did you refuse to sign the summary? Maya watched the numbers rise above the doors. Because I have spent 6 years asking people to trust the integrity of our process, she said. I could not put my name under something written before you entered the room. The elevator continued upward. Richard had known Annie's identity. He had limited the documents brought to the meeting. He had prepared a judgment before hearing her speak. The humiliation had not been an impulsive act. It had been arranged. When the elevator doors opened, Evelyn Parker was waiting in the hallway with a yellow legal pad tucked beneath one arm. Miss Rodriguez, take the interview room on the left. Miss Carter, come with me. Maya stopped. Are we not allowed to speak to each other? You may speak about anything unrelated to this investigation. For now, I need each of you to remember events without adjusting your memories to match someone else's. Maya nodded and entered the smaller room. Evelyn led Annie back into the conference room. The torn contract had been removed from the floor and placed inside clear evidence sleeves. Richard's briefcase remained on the table, untouched. 2 compliance officers sat near the door. Richard was no longer there. Where is he? Annie asked. In another office with counsel. His counsel? Company counsel. Whether they continue representing him will depend on what we find. Evelyn sat and opened a file. Miss Rodriguez says Mr. Hale ordered her to prepare a negative leadership assessment 2 days before meeting you. She told me, I know. I permitted her to disclose that much because you were named in the document. Do you have any prior history with Mr. Hale? I had never spoken to him. Had you seen him? Only in company announcements. Had he seen you? Annie thought about the sealed disclosure Richard had opened. He had seen my name. That is not the same thing. No. Evelyn slid a printed email across the table. Richard had sent it to Maya on Saturday morning. Prepare an executive risk summary regarding Carter Safe Signal. Emphasize leadership maturity, limited operating history, and reputational exposure. Do not circulate the technical appendix until further instruction. Annie read it twice. He decided what the summary should say before asking her to write it. Yes. Why would he put that in an email? Powerful people often mistake obedience for discretion. Annie handed it back. Does this prove discrimination? It supports a pattern. It does not establish the entire motive. What would? More evidence than we currently have. Evelyn opened a second folder. I need you to explain Appendix D without assuming I understand the system. Annie pulled the Carter Beacon unit closer. It was no larger than a hardback book, with a narrow light strip across the front and a printed identification code on the back. The device creates a maintenance record whenever it is tested, serviced, disconnected, or restored. The record includes the unit number, time, technician credentials, and the type of work performed. Can someone change the record? Corrections can be added, but the original entry remains visible. So the system does not prevent misconduct. No system can do that. It makes misconduct harder to hide. Evelyn tapped the file. And the pilot data exposed problems in Whitmore's existing records? It exposed inconsistencies. I don't know why they exist. Give me an example. At Jefferson Courts, the maintenance database says every supplemental alert unit was inspected last November. And your pilot? Several devices still carried internal battery dates from more than 2 years earlier. That could be clerical error. Yes. How many? 47 in one building. Evelyn stopped writing. At Franklin Terrace, Annie continued, the records show a technician completed inspections in 3 buildings within the same 12-minute period. Could multiple technicians have used one account? That would violate procedure, but it's possible. And Rosewood Towers? Residents reported visual alert units disconnected for months. The maintenance records showed them as active. Evelyn leaned back. You understand why I cannot accept residents' reports as final proof. Yes, that's why Appendix D describes discrepancies, not fraud. But Mr. Hale removed it. Yes. A compliance officer entered and handed Evelyn a note. She read it, folded it once and placed it beneath her legal pad. What happened? Annie asked. Mr. Hale claims he removed the appendix because the data was incomplete and could expose the company to false allegations. Then why didn't he ask us to verify it? That is one of the questions he has not answered. Evelyn closed the file. I also need to ask about Thomas Whitmore. Annie's shoulders tightened. Again? Richard's defense now rests on the claim that your company received special treatment. We must examine that claim as thoroughly as the allegations against him. Thomas didn't fund Carter Safe Signal. Did he pay for your education? Yes. Your housing? Yes. Health insurance? Yes. Did that support make it possible for you to spend time developing the system? Annie looked at her. Evelyn's tone remained neutral. This is not an accusation. It sounds like one. It is a difficult question. Those are not always the same thing. Annie looked down at the Carter Beacon unit. Thomas gave me stability. I did not have to worry about rent or whether I could afford a doctor. That mattered. Then why not say so? Because people hear that and decide he built everything else. People may decide that regardless. Annie's mouth tightened. Evelyn continued. Independence does not require pretending no one helped you. It requires describing the help accurately. Annie was silent for several seconds. My father taught me to ask questions, she said. Helen taught me how to test the answers. Thomas gave me a home where I had time to keep working after I failed. None of them designed Carter Beacon. That is a better answer than simply saying you did everything alone. I never said that. No, but you sometimes speak as though accepting care weakens your claim to your own work. The observation landed harder than Annie expected. A knock came at the door. Maya entered with a compliance officer behind her. She looked tired but more certain than before. Miss Parker asked me to identify the executive accounts that accessed Appendix D, she said. Evelyn gestured for her to continue. Richard's account removed it from the board packet. But another account opened the source data 3 times during the previous month. Whose? Annie asked. Creston Safety Services had temporary access through the maintenance portal. Evelyn looked up. A vendor could access bid comparison material? They should not have been able to, Maya said. Their permissions were expanded by an executive administrator. Which administrator? Maya placed a printout on the table. Richard Hale's name appeared at the bottom of the authorization. Annie looked from the page to Carter Beacon. Creston had not merely been mentioned in the appendix. Someone inside Whitmore had allowed the company to see what Annie's system had found before the board ever received it. Evelyn picked up the phone. Freeze Creston's access immediately. Preserve every login, download, and message connected to that account. She ended the call and faced Annie. Do not contact anyone at Creston. I don't know anyone there. They know you. Annie looked at the printed access history again. Richard had seen her sealed identity. Creston had seen the maintenance comparison. Both had known what Carter Beacon threatened to reveal before Annie entered the conference room. The torn contract had been meant to look like a man losing his temper. It was beginning to look more like the final step of a plan. By late afternoon, Evelyn had arranged for the Carter Beacon prototype and its source records to be transferred to the independent laboratory that had conducted the original tests. She did not allow Annie to carry the device herself. It belongs to my company, Annie said as a compliance officer placed it inside a sealed transport case. It is also evidence now, Evelyn replied. For the next few days, those two facts must exist together. Helen Brooks met them the following morning outside a converted brick warehouse in South Philadelphia. She wore a brown wool coat, carried a paper cup of coffee, and held a cinnamon roll inside a folded napkin. You look terrible, she told Annie. Good morning to you too. Did you sleep? A little. That means no. Helen handed her the cinnamon roll. Eat before you start defending your life's work. Annie accepted it. The gesture reminded her of Thomas and the unfinished toast on the kitchen counter, but she kept the thought to herself. Inside the laboratory, Evelyn introduced Dr. Samuel Lynn, the electrical engineer assigned to lead the new review. He was in his early 60s and spoke without wasting words. I reviewed the previous certification, he said. My team will repeat the required tests using archived procedures. We will also compare the current source files with the versions submitted during the original review. Richard's attorney stood near the back wall. My client requests that the laboratory examine whether Miss Carter had the education required to create the system. Dr. Lynn looked at him. We test devices, records, and engineering claims. We do not certify biographies. The inventor's qualifications are relevant. The inventor's work is relevant. If the work fails, we will document it. If it passes, her age will not make the result less accurate. Helen took a slow drink of coffee to hide her satisfaction. Annie placed her backpack beneath a chair. What do you need from me? Nothing until we ask, Dr. Lynn said. You may observe, but you may not assist. Annie nodded. The first tests were familiar. The team checked the local warning functions, the visual signal, the multilingual notification settings, and the backup operation when network access was removed. They examined the maintenance log and attempted to alter an existing entry. The correction appeared, but the original record remained visible. Evelyn watched from behind a glass partition. That is the feature Appendix D relied on? Yes, Annie said. The system preserves the first entry and records who made any correction. So a property manager cannot quietly change the date of an inspection. They can correct an error, but everyone can see that it was corrected. Helen glanced at Annie. Tell her the part you always leave out. Annie frowned. Which part? You did not design that feature correctly the first time. Dr. Lynn looked up from the workstation. Annie sighed. The original version allowed authorized administrators to replace an entry. And why did you change it? Evelyn asked. Because Helen said an honest system should not require every administrator to remain honest forever. Helen shook her head. That is not what I said. It was close. I said, never build a lock that depends on everyone promising not to use the key. Evelyn wrote the sentence in her notes. The laboratory team continued through the morning. One technician compared Annie's source history with the archived files. Another reviewed timestamps, contributor access, and change logs. Shortly before noon, Dr. Lynn called Annie to the workstation. We found an outside contributor listed on the signal controller revision. Malcolm Price, Annie said. He reviewed that circuit when I was 16. What did he contribute? He identified instability under low voltage conditions and recommended a different regulator. Did he write the replacement design? No, I did, after he explained the failure. Did he receive ownership? No. His consulting agreement defines the work as technical review. Richard's attorney stepped closer. So, without Dr. Price, the system might not function. Annie turned toward him. Without the laboratory rejecting my first two versions, it might not function either. That does not mean the laboratory invented it. Helen folded her arms. Engineering is not weakened by correction. It is weakened when people hide errors to protect their pride. Dr. Lin opened the signed consulting agreement. The document supports Miss Carter's account. The attorney said nothing more. During lunch, Annie sat with Helen at a small metal table near the loading entrance. Delivery trucks passed outside, their engines echoing against the brick walls. "Do you remember the first time you brought the prototype here?" Helen asked. "I remember you wouldn't let me plug it in. You had exposed wiring. I was 14. Electricity did not care." Annie smiled despite herself. Helen unwrapped a turkey sandwich. "Your father brought you to one of my tenant meetings when you were 9. I don't remember that. You sat in the front row and corrected a diagram on my handout. Was I right? You were irritating." "That wasn't my question." Helen laughed. "Yes, you were right." Annie looked through the glass at the Carter beacon unit on the test bench. "Richard knew who I was before the meeting. Evelyn told me. He knew I was Thomas's daughter and still decided I had stolen the work. Maybe he did not act despite knowing. Maybe he acted because he knew." Annie looked at her. Helen continued. "A young black woman with a famous white father creates a story Richard can use in either direction. Before Thomas arrived, he could call you unqualified. After Thomas arrived, he could call you privileged. So there was no answer I could give. There was no answer he intended to accept." Dr. Lin appeared at the door before Annie could respond. "We completed the primary review." They returned to the laboratory. Evelyn stood beside the test bench, her legal pad closed. Dr. Lin addressed the room. "The current Carter beacon unit meets the performance requirements documented in the original certification. The source history supports Ms. Carter's claim that she developed the initial prototype and system architecture. The contributions of outside engineers were disclosed and fall within their written consulting roles." Annie released a breath. Richard's attorney asked, "Are you saying the system is perfect?" "No," Dr. Lin replied. "No responsible engineer would say that. I am saying the evidence does not support claims of stolen work, fabricated testing, or concealed technical assistance." Evelyn opened a new folder. "Then the questions regarding the contract have narrowed." "To what?" Annie asked. Evelyn placed several printed invoices on the table. "To why Creston Safety Services charged Whitmore Residential Group for maintenance that the existing devices do not appear to have received." She pointed to 3 buildings Annie recognized from Appendix D. "The technical evidence supports your system," Evelyn said. "Now we have to follow the money behind the system Richard tried to protect." Annie looked at the Carter beacon's steady green light. Richard had called her too young to be trusted with thousands of lives. The device had answered him without anger, status, or influence. It had simply worked. Evelyn arranged the Creston invoices across a steel work table in the laboratory's conference room. There were more than 40 of them, each printed from Whitmore Residential Group's accounting system and marked with a building code, service date, and technician number. Annie recognized several addresses from the deployment list. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked. "Consistency," Evelyn said. "Or the lack of it." Maya opened the maintenance database on a secured laptop. Creston billed the company for quarterly inspections, battery replacements, and signal testing. Dr. Lin picked up one invoice. "This says technicians replaced 32 backup batteries at Jefferson Courts on November 9th. Annie checked Appendix D. "Our pilot team inspected that building 3 weeks later. 26 units still had batteries manufactured more than 2 years earlier." "Could Creston have installed old inventory?" Maya asked. "They could have," Dr. Lin said. "It would be poor practice, but possible." Evelyn placed another invoice beside it. "Then we do not call it fraud. We call it an inconsistency and find supporting records." They worked through the afternoon. The same patterns appeared across different properties. Creston billed for equipment that residents said had not been touched. Service forms at buildings miles apart carried identical timestamps. Several technician signatures appeared too uniform, as though copied from one document to another. Annie enlarged a group of work orders. These 3 inspections were completed at 10:14 a.m. Maya leaned closer. Different buildings: Franklin Terrace, Rosewood Towers, and Jefferson Courts. Dr. Lin checked the addresses. A technician could not travel between them in the same minute. "Maybe 3 technicians shared one account," Maya said. "Then the company violated its own verification policy. Evelyn replied. Either explanation creates a problem. A compliance analyst entered, carrying a folder from accounts payable. We found the original vendor approval forms. Evelyn opened the folder. Creston's annual contract had been renewed twice without competitive bidding. Each renewal included a written exemption stating that changing providers would create an unacceptable safety risk. The exemptions had been signed by Richard Hale. Annie read the first one. He argued replacing Creston would endanger residents. Yes, Evelyn said, but he tried to stop the company that found gaps in Creston's records. Yes, Maya scrolled through the approvals. Richard wasn't CEO when the first Creston contract was awarded. He was Chief Operating Officer. So this began before his promotion, Annie said. Evelyn gathered the pages into date order. That appears likely. The analyst handed her one final sheet. There's also a consulting expense attached to Creston's account. Which consultant? Northbridge Consulting LLC. Maya's fingers stopped above the keyboard. I've seen that name. Where? In Richard's calendar. There were private meetings marked Northbridge Review. I assumed it was a property acquisition. Evelyn asked the analyst, who owns the company? We're still confirming. Annie looked at the amounts. They were smaller than the maintenance invoices and spread across many months. Why divide the payments like this? To avoid attention, Maya said, then caught herself. Possibly. Evelyn nodded. Keep that word. Possibly. Investigations are damaged when suspicion starts speaking as fact. Annie understood the warning was meant for all of them. By 6 o'clock, Evelyn ended the session. The records would remain with compliance, and no one was permitted to discuss Northbridge outside the investigation. Thomas was waiting for Annie in the lobby. He stood when she approached but did not ask what they had found. Ready to go home? Yes. He held out her coat. Annie took it from him and put it on herself. Outside, the evening air had turned cold. They rode in silence through Center City. Past office windows and SEPTA buses filled with people heading home. Thomas checked his phone once, then placed it face down. You're making an effort, Annie said. To do what? Not ask questions. I have asked at least 12 in my head. And answered how many? Most of them badly. At home, Thomas warmed tomato soup while Annie made grilled cheese sandwiches. The kitchen was quiet except for the scrape of a spatula against the pan. Thomas finally said, Can I ask a question that is not about confidential evidence? You can try. Do you still trust the contract? Annie turned one sandwich. I trust the scoring process more than I trust some of the people who manage it. That sounds like a distinction Evelyn would approve of. She says clean answers are often unreliable. Thomas poured the soup into 2 bowls. She has always distrusted anyone who sounds too certain. Is that why you hired her? That is why the board hired her after she told me one of my early compliance policies was useless. Annie carried the plates to the table. What did you do? I argued for 20 minutes. And then? I replaced the policy. They sat across from each other. Thomas tore his sandwich in half and dipped one side into the soup. Your father hated that, he said. What? Dipping sandwiches. Annie looked up. He did it all the time. Not grilled cheese. He absolutely did. He said the bread became wet. He said that about crackers. Thomas considered this. I may have confused 2 arguments. Annie smiled for the first time since leaving the laboratory. The expression faded when she looked at the chair beside her. Daniel had never sat in this kitchen, but there were moments when Thomas's stories placed him there. What else did he say at those tenant meetings? She asked. Thomas set down his sandwich. He said people with money often treated maintenance as an expense and emergencies as bad luck. Annie waited. He believed neglect was rarely one large decision. It was a series of small choices made by people who assumed someone else would deal with the result. That sounds like him. He also said a checklist could become a hiding place. What did he mean? If people cared more about signing the form than doing the work, the form protected the institution instead of the residents. Annie thought of the identical timestamps and copied signatures. Carter Beacon makes that harder, Thomas said. She looked at him. That sounds like a question. It is an observation. You're not supposed to know what the investigation found. I know what your system was designed to do. Annie leaned back. It records the first entry. Corrections remain visible, so a company cannot quietly rewrite its maintenance history. Not without leaving a trail. Thomas nodded slowly. Then Richard may not have feared the device. He feared the record. Neither of them spoke for a while. Thomas looked toward the tin box on the kitchen shelf where Daniel's old newspaper clipping was kept. "Your father used to say danger rarely announced itself with a dramatic entrance," he said. "Sometimes it arrived as a missing signature, an inspection postponed until next month, or a bill everyone assumed someone else had checked." Annie stared into her soup. Richard had treated Appendix D like an inconvenience, then removed it before the board could read it. Creston had accessed the data before Annie entered the conference room. Someone had paid Northbridge in amounts small enough to pass unnoticed. The danger Daniel had warned about was not always smoke or an alarm. Sometimes it was a clean invoice attached to work that might never have been done. Annie reached for her father's notebook and opened it beside her plate. Near the bottom of one page, Daniel had written a sentence in faded blue ink. "If a record says everyone did their job, ask who checked the record." She turned the notebook so Thomas could read it. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The next morning, Maya arrived at Whitmore Residential Group before 7. The executive floor was nearly empty, and the lights above half the workstations had not yet switched on. She carried coffee from the corner deli, but left it untouched beside her keyboard. Richard's message had arrived at 5:42 a.m. "Come to my office before speaking with Parker. Bring the Carter Safe Signal scoring summary." Maya read it twice, then forwarded it to Evelyn under the legal hold protocol. A second message appeared less than a minute later. "This is a direct executive instruction." Maya did not answer. She opened the original scoring file instead. Carter Safe Signal had ranked first in technical performance, long-term cost, accessibility, and maintenance transparency. The company had lost points only because of its short operating history. Even after that deduction, it remained ahead of Creston Safety Services by 14 points. Maya printed the result and placed it inside a folder. Richard appeared at her desk before she could close the drawer. "You ignored my message. I forwarded it to independent counsel." His eyes settled on the folder. "What is that?" "The scoring record Miss Parker requested. I asked for a summary. The original record is clearer." Richard pulled out the chair beside her desk and sat without invitation. "You are allowing this situation to become personal." Maya turned toward him. "I did not tear the contract." "No. But you are helping Annie Carter use an internal review to damage this company. She asked us to preserve the records. She asked because she knows the chairman will protect her." Mr. Whitmore recused himself. Richard leaned closer. "People like him do not need to enter the room to control it." Maya glanced toward the security camera above the corridor. Richard noticed and lowered his voice. "I need a written statement from you," he said. "You will explain that Carter Safe Signal lacks experienced leadership, and that the selection process did not give sufficient weight to operational risk. That isn't what the scoring shows. The scoring was incomplete. Then why did you wait until after the company won?" His expression hardened. "You are not qualified to question executive judgment. I am qualified to explain the process I manage." Richard slid a single sheet of paper across her desk. Her name was already typed beneath the final paragraph. Maya read it. The statement claimed Annie had been unable to answer technical questions, had relied on unnamed consultants, and had pressured employees by referring to her relationship with Thomas Whitmore. None of it was true. "I won't sign this." Richard's voice remained calm. "You should think carefully." "I have. You applied for a mortgage last month." Maya looked up. He continued. "A period of unemployment could complicate that." For a moment, she could hear only the ventilation system above them. "That information is in my personnel file. I make it my business to understand the people who work for me." "No," Maya said. "You make it your business to know what frightens them." Richard stood. "By the end of the day, Miss Rodriguez." He walked away, leaving the statement on her desk. Maya stared at her printed name. 6 years earlier, she had joined Whitmore Residential Group because she believed a clear process could protect smaller contractors from being dismissed by men who had already chosen the winner. She had defended that process in meetings, training sessions, and vendor appeals. Now the chief executive wanted to use her signature to prove the process had failed. She photographed the statement through the evidence preservation application and called Evelyn. By noon, Evelyn had arranged a meeting at a diner several blocks from the office. Annie arrived wearing jeans, a gray sweater, and the same dark blue backpack. She slid into the booth across from Maya while an older waitress filled 2 coffee cups without asking. Maya pushed the unsigned statement across the table. "He wants me to say you could not answer his technical questions." Annie read it. "He didn't ask any." "I know. He also says I used Thomas's name to pressure you. You did the opposite. Annie returned the page. What happens if you refuse? I could lose my job. Then don't do this for me. Maya stared at her. You think that makes it easier? No, I think you should know I won't judge you for protecting your life. The waitress returned, set down 2 slices of apple pie and said, You both look like you forgot lunch. We didn't order these, Maya said. Man at the counter did. Samuel Reed, the security officer from the conference room, lifted his coffee mug from a stool near the register. He gave them a small nod and turned back to his newspaper. Annie looked at the pie. My father used to do that. Buy food for strangers? Feed people before asking them to make difficult decisions. Maya wrapped both hands around her coffee. Richard mentioned my mortgage. Annie's face changed. He threatened you? Not directly. That is how he does it. He leaves enough room to say you misunderstood. What do you want to do? I don't know. Annie waited. Maya looked through the window at the people crossing the street. My parents owned a grocery store in Reading. A regional chain moved in and offered to buy them out. When they refused, the chain pressured suppliers to stop extending credit. What happened? They lost the store. I'm sorry. My father kept every invoice for 22 years. After the store closed, he still said records mattered. I used to think he was trying to prove someone had cheated him. Was he? No, he was proving to himself that he had not imagined what happened. Annie opened her father's notebook and placed it between them. Daniel wrote everything down too. Maya read the sentence at the top of the open page. If a record says everyone did their job, ask who checked the record. Maya gave a tired smile. Your father and mine would have argued for hours. They probably would have enjoyed it. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Maya said, I found emails. Annie did not reach for them. Have you given them to Evelyn? Not yet. Do that first. You don't want to know what they say? I do, but I don't want Richard claiming I influenced a witness. Maya studied her, then took out her phone and sent Evelyn the files through the protected channel. The emails showed Richard directing staff to reduce Carter Safe Signal's leadership score after the technical review. One message said a teenage black founder would make the company's safety program look like a charitable experiment. Another ordered the maintenance appendix removed before the board meeting. The last email named Northbridge Consulting. Maya looked at Annie. There's more. Northbridge is owned by Evan Hale, Richard's brother. His brother-in-law. The waitress passed again and warmed their coffee. Maya looked down at the statement Richard wanted her to sign. Silence can still become a signature, she said, if you let someone else put your name beneath a lie. She tore the statement once through the center, then stopped. Annie looked at the 2 pieces. Keep them, she said. Evelyn may need the original. Maya placed the torn page back together and slid both halves into the folder. Richard had counted on her fear. He had forgotten fear could survive in the same room as a decision. By 8 the next morning, Annie's name was on every local news site in Philadelphia. The first headline appeared above a photograph taken from her company website. 18-year, old founder faces, questions over safety technology. The second used a still image from outside Whitmore Residential Group, showing Thomas with one hand near Annie's shoulder. Billionaire's daughter awarded. $5 million contract. Neither article discussed the anonymous scoring process. Neither mentioned Richard's attempt to remove Appendix D. Then a video appeared. Dr. Malcolm Price sat beneath the studio lights of a morning television program, wearing a gray suit and the expression of a man disappointed by something he had once believed in. I don't want to diminish Annie's talent, he told the host. She is bright and ambitious, but the public deserves an honest account of how Carter Beacon was developed. Annie watched from Helen's office. Helen stood beside the window with her arms folded. The host leaned forward. Are you saying the system was not Annie Carter's invention? I'm saying no 18-year-old develops a public safety platform without substantial professional guidance. That isn't an answer, Helen muttered. Malcolm continued. I provided technical direction during a critical stage. Other engineers did as well. The public has been given the impression that Annie created the entire system alone in a bedroom. I've never said that, Annie said. Helen lowered the volume. He knows. Annie looked at her. Why would he do this? Recognition, money, resentment. Pick one. The phone on Helen's desk rang. Evelyn Parker's name appeared on the screen. Annie answered. I'm watching it. Do not respond publicly yet, Evelyn said. Dr. Price signed a consulting agreement defining his contribution. We are retrieving the original. He's making it sound like I stole his work. He is choosing his words carefully. So should you. Did Richard contact him? We found 3 calls between Richard's office and Dr. Price this week. That does not prove what they discussed. The television host asked Malcolm whether he believed Carter Beacon was safe. I believe parts of it are promising, he replied. My concern is whether the person presented as its creator has enough experience to oversee deployment. Annie turned off the television. He signed the certification report, she said. He certified the controller revision he reviewed, Helen replied. Not the whole system. He told me I had done good work. He probably believed it when no one was asking who deserved the credit. Annie walked to the filing cabinet and removed a box labeled Controller Revision 2. Inside were notebooks, printed emails, and a consulting agreement dated 2 years earlier. Malcolm had been hired after the second Carter Beacon prototype failed during a low-voltage test. He identified instability in one part of the circuit and recommended several possible regulators. Annie selected one, redesigned the board, and documented the changes. She found an email he had sent after reviewing the corrected version. The redesign is yours. My role was diagnostic. Keep this message with your development records. Helen read it over Annie's shoulder. That sentence will matter. It should not have to. No, but it does. By noon, a second segment aired. Malcolm repeated his claims and said he was considering all available options to protect his professional contribution. Richard's public relations team released a statement an hour later. Whitmore Residential Group takes all intellectual property concerns seriously and has suspended the Carter Safe Signal contract pending independent review. Annie read it twice. They made it sound as though the suspension happened because of Malcolm. That is why they released it today, Helen said. Annie's phone filled with messages. Some offered support. Others accused her of fraud. One reporter asked whether Thomas had purchased the patent for her. Another wanted to know whether Carter Safe Signal had any adult employees. Thomas called, but Annie let it ring once before answering. I am not asking what the investigation found, he said immediately. Good. I'm asking whether you have eaten. Helen gave me oatmeal. It was terrible, Helen called from across the room. Thomas heard her. Then I'll send lunch. No press team, no company statement, and no lawyers calling the network. I did not say any of those things. You were thinking them. I was thinking worse things. Annie sat at Helen's desk. Malcolm helped me. I never denied that. Then say exactly what he did. Evelyn told me not to respond yet. Listen to Evelyn. I thought you were calling to help. I am. Sometimes helping means telling you not to act while you are angry. Annie looked at the dark television screen. Did my father ever have someone take credit for his work? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Many times. What did he do? He corrected the record once. Then he returned to the work. That sounds too simple. It was not simple. He complained for 3 days. Annie almost smiled. To you? To anyone who remained within hearing distance. Thomas's voice softened. He understood that dignity did not require pretending something had not hurt him. After the call, Evelyn sent the original records. Malcolm's agreement described him as an independent technical reviewer. It stated that all existing and resulting intellectual property belonged to Carter Safe Signal. His invoices listed 38 hours of work. His signature appeared only on the low-voltage controller review. More important, Annie's development logs showed the first Carter Beacon prototype had existed 18 months before Malcolm joined the project. Evelyn arranged one interview with a technology reporter from a Philadelphia newspaper. No television studio, no dramatic debate, and no Thomas beside her. The reporter met Annie at the independent laboratory that afternoon. Did Dr. Price contribute to Carter Beacon? She asked. Yes. How much? He diagnosed a problem in the signal controller and recommended options. I redesigned that part of the system after his review, so you did not create the product alone. No responsible safety product is created, tested, and approved by one person alone. Why should the public call you its inventor? Annie placed the first prototype on the table. Its plastic casing was uneven, and a strip of tape still covered one side. Because I created the first design, wrote the original software, and developed the system architecture. I also documented every person who improved it. Are you accusing Dr. Price of lying? I'm releasing the records. People can read his contract, his emails, and my development timeline. The reporter glanced at the old prototype. Does it bother you that people believed him so quickly? Yes. Why do you think they did? Annie considered the question before answering. Because some people find it easier to believe an experienced man is being denied credit than to believe a young black woman gave it to him accurately. The reporter did not interrupt. Annie continued. Dr. Price helped me, saying that does not reduce my work. His mistake is believing his contribution gives him ownership of everything that came before and after it. The interview was published that evening alongside the contracts, emails, and dated design files. The article did not call Annie a genius or a victim. It laid out the timeline. Within hours, several engineers who had worked on Carter Beacon confirmed her account. Dr. Lin released a statement that the independent review supported Annie's authorship and found all consulting contributions properly disclosed. Shortly before midnight, Malcolm sent Evelyn a letter withdrawing his claim. He admitted Richard had offered him a future consulting position but insisted no formal payment had been made. Annie read the letter at the kitchen table while Thomas poured 2 cups of tea. Are you going to answer him? He asked. Not tonight. Good. She placed the letter beside Daniel's notebook. Richard had tried to replace Annie's work with Malcolm's title, age, and reputation. For one day, it had nearly worked. But reputations depended on what people were willing to believe. A timeline depended only on what had happened. 3 days after Malcolm withdrew his claim, Evelyn called Annie and asked her to come to a law office near Rittenhouse Square. Richard requested a settlement conference, she said. His attorney will be present. So will I. What kind of settlement? He has not provided the full terms. Then why meet? Because refusing to hear an offer gives him a story he can use later. Listening does not require acceptance. The conference room was smaller than the one at Whitmore Residential Group. There were no windows, no company photographs, and no chair placed at the head of the table. Evelyn sat beside Annie with a yellow legal pad. Richard entered with his attorney and a thin black folder. He looked different without the executive floor behind him. His suit was still expensive, but there were shadows beneath his eyes, and he no longer walked as though every room belonged to him. Richard's attorney began. This meeting is confidential and conducted without admission of wrongdoing. Evelyn looked at him. We understand how settlement conferences work. The attorney slid the folder across the table. Annie did not open it. Richard leaned back. You should read the number before deciding to make another speech. I didn't come to make a speech. Good. Then perhaps we can be practical. Annie opened the folder. The first page offered Carter Safe Signal a payment of $8 million. The amount was larger than the original contract. It would settle the discrimination complaint, the destroyed agreement, and all claims arising from the suspension. The next pages contained the conditions. Carter Safe Signal would transfer control of the Carter Beacon patent portfolio to Whitmore Residential Group. Annie would remain listed as the original founder, but the company would decide where the system was installed, how it was priced, and which maintenance data could be released. The original deployment list of 312 buildings would be replaced by a smaller group selected after a commercial feasibility review. Annie read the final clause twice. She looked up. You want my patents? We want stability, Richard said. You want control of the maintenance records. His attorney answered. The company would own data generated on its properties. That is standard. The residents' alerts and device status belong to the safety program. The maintenance history is supposed to remain visible to inspectors and tenant representatives. Richard folded his hands. That level of access creates liability. It creates accountability. It creates opportunities for incomplete data to be misunderstood by people who lack technical training. Annie closed the folder. People like the board? Richard's attorney shifted in his chair. Miss Carter, the offer allows you to become financially secure before your 19th birthday. You would retain a public advisory role and receive compensation for future appearances. Appearances? You would remain associated with the mission, but not the decisions. Richard gave a tired sigh. You said you wanted the system installed. This agreement puts the resources of a national company behind it. At which buildings? That would be determined later. What happens to Jefferson Courts? Richard did not answer. Franklin Terrace? Annie, Evelyn said quietly. Let him answer. Richard looked at the contract. Some properties may not justify immediate investment. They were all included in the signed agreement. The original agreement was drafted before the company completed a full risk assessment. The company completed 4 months of review, and the process failed to consider the limitations of your leadership. Annie looked at him. We are back to that? We never left it. No. You moved from saying I stole the design to saying I was favored by Thomas. Then you found Malcolm. Now you are offering me $8 million to surrender the system you said I wasn't capable of creating. Richard's attorney raised a hand. The payment reflects the desire to avoid further disruption. It reflects the value of what he wants hidden. Richard's expression sharpened. Be careful. Evelyn placed her pen down. Do not threaten my client. I am warning her against making unsupported accusations. Annie reopened the folder and pointed to the confidentiality clause. This says I cannot discuss Creston Safety Services, Appendix D, or any maintenance discrepancy discovered during the pilot. Those are internal business matters, Richard said. They are the reason you tore the contract. That is your interpretation. It is the only part of this offer you seem unwilling to negotiate. Richard leaned toward her. You have built a useful product. That does not mean you understand how large companies operate. Every record cannot be handed to tenants, reporters, and city officials the moment someone finds an inconsistency. Why not? Because mistakes happen. Data is incomplete. People overreact. Shareholders lose confidence. Contracts disappear. Employees lose jobs. And residents? What about them? Annie looked at him for several seconds. My father used to say that whenever someone explained why safety had to wait, the explanation always included money and rarely included the people sleeping in the building. Richard glanced at Evelyn. Is this relevant? Yes, Evelyn said. You are asking her to abandon the purpose of her company. Her reasons for refusing are relevant. Richard turned back to Annie. Your father is not in this room. No, but his work is the reason I am. He saved Thomas Whitmore. That gave you a home, an education and access most young people never receive. You continue speaking as though you built your life without help. Annie did not answer immediately. Evelyn watched her but did not intervene. Finally, Annie said, Thomas gave me stability. Helen gave me guidance. Engineers corrected my mistakes. The laboratory rejected bad versions until I made them better. I have never denied any of that. Then accept what is being offered. Help is not the same as ownership. Richard's face tightened. Annie pushed the folder back across the table. My father did not teach me to build a warning only for people rich enough to hear it. Richard's attorney looked at Evelyn. Is that a formal rejection? Yes, Annie said. And I want the rejection recorded with one additional request. What request? Evelyn asked. Preserve every draft of this offer, especially the clauses concerning Creston and maintenance, data access. Richard stood. This meeting is over. Evelyn remained seated. Your attorney will confirm that the documents are already subject to the legal hold. Richard looked at him. The attorney gave a reluctant nod. Outside the conference room, Maya was waiting near the elevators with a sealed envelope pressed against her side. Annie stopped. What happened? I finished reviewing the Northbridge records. Evelyn opened the envelope. Inside were payment schedules, internal approvals, and a corporate registration form naming Northbridge Consulting's owner, Evan Hale, Richard's brother-in-law. Maya looked at Annie. There's also an email from Richard. He told accounting to divide the payments so they would remain below the level requiring board review. Evelyn read the first page, then returned everything to the envelope. The settlement was not an attempt to avoid disruption, she said. It was an attempt to purchase silence before we completed the financial trail. Annie looked back at the closed conference room door. $8 million had been placed in front of her as though it were freedom. Now she understood it had been priced as a lock. 4 weeks after Richard tore the contract, Annie entered the boardroom carrying the same dark blue backpack. The room overlooked Center City, but the blinds had been lowered against the morning sun. 12 board members sat around the long table. Evelyn Parker occupied a smaller table near the screen with 2 compliance attorneys. Maya sat beside her own counsel, a closed laptop in front of her. Helen Brooks had taken a seat behind Annie. Thomas sat in the second row with the observers. He did not approach Annie when she entered. He only met her eyes and gave a small nod. Beside you, not in front of you. Richard was already at the table. His access to company systems had been restricted, but he still held the title of chief executive pending the board's decision. He wore a dark suit and had arranged 3 folders in front of him. From a distance, he looked much as he had on the morning Annie arrived to sign the contract. Only his hands had changed. They never stopped moving. The chairwoman of the special committee, Margaret Ellis, opened the meeting. This hearing concerns the Carter Safe Signal contract, the conduct of senior employees during the contracting process and related financial matters. Mr. Whitmore has recused himself and will not vote. Thomas said nothing. Margaret looked toward Richard. "You asked to speak first." Richard stood. "For 23 years, I have worked in property management and corporate operations. Every decision I made in this matter was intended to protect residents and this company from unacceptable risk." He spoke without notes at first. He described Carter Safe Signal as a young business with limited operating history. He said Annie's relationship with Thomas had created an undisclosed appearance of influence, even though the relationship had been filed with legal. He called the contract meeting tense and said his actions had been misrepresented by people who viewed an executive disagreement through the lens of race and age. "I did not object to Miss Carter because she is a young black woman," he said. "I objected because public safety demands experience." Annie felt Helen shift behind her, but neither of them spoke. Richard continued. "When I learned that the chairman's daughter was connected to a $5 million agreement, I believed an immediate pause was justified. I regret tearing the paper. It was an emotional response under pressure, but destroying a printed copy did not invalidate the contract, and no resident was placed in immediate danger." Margaret folded her hands. "Did you read the full technical file before confronting Miss Carter?" Richard hesitated. "I reviewed the executive materials available to me." That was not the question. His eyes moved briefly toward Evelyn. "No, I had not read the complete file." "Did you know Miss Carter was Thomas Whitmore's daughter before she entered the room?" "My office had access to the conflict disclosure." "Did you personally open it?" "I do not remember." Evelyn rose. "We can assist with that." The screen behind the board lit up. An access log appeared, showing Richard's account opening Annie's sealed disclosure 3 days before the meeting. Richard's attorney leaned toward him, but Richard kept his eyes on the screen. Evelyn addressed the board. "Mr. Hale opened the disclosure at 8:16 on Friday morning. He remained in the file for 4 minutes. On Saturday, he instructed Maya Rodriguez to prepare a negative leadership assessment of Carter Safe Signal before he had met Annie Carter." The email appeared next. "Emphasized leadership maturity, limited operating history, and reputational exposure." Margaret looked at Richard. "Why did you claim surprise when Mr. Whitmore called her his daughter?" "I was surprised by the nature of their relationship. The disclosure identified her as his legally adopted daughter." Richard's mouth tightened. "I had reviewed many records that week." Evelyn changed the display. The conference room video began without sound. Annie watched herself standing near the table while Richard flipped through the contract. The audio came in as she offered him the fire department approval. He did not take it. The room heard Richard ask where the real engineer was. They heard Annie explain the licensing process. They heard Maya confirm that legal had approved the agreement. Then came the sound of paper tearing. No one in the boardroom moved. The video showed Annie kneeling to collect the pages while Richard ordered security to remove her. Evelyn stopped the recording. "Mr. Hale has described the incident as an executive disagreement. The full recording shows that Miss Carter repeatedly offered documentation and requested verification. Mr. Hale declined each request." Richard's attorney stood. "The recording does not establish discriminatory intent." "No," Evelyn said. "It establishes conduct. Intent will be addressed through the other evidence." She displayed the anonymous scoring results. Carter Safe Signal ranked first in technical performance, accessibility, long-term cost and maintenance transparency. Creston Safety Services ranked third overall and 14 points below Annie's company. The scoring panel did not know Miss Carter's age, race, gender, or relationship with Mr. Whitmore. Evelyn said, "No evidence indicates that Mr. Whitmore participated in the evaluation." A board member named Charles Bennett adjusted his glasses. "What about the claim that other engineers developed the product?" Dr. Samuel Lynn joined the meeting by video from the independent laboratory. "Our review found that Annie Carter created the original prototype, wrote the initial software, and developed the system architecture. Licensed engineers evaluated specific components. Those contributions were documented through written consulting agreements." "Did Malcolm Price invent any part of Carter Beacon?" Charles asked. Dr. Price diagnosed instability in one controller revision and recommended possible components. Miss Carter completed the redesign. His agreement gives him no ownership interest. Evelyn displayed Malcolm's retraction. It included his admission that Richard had offered him future consulting work shortly before his television appearance. Richard leaned toward his microphone. "No contract was signed with Dr. Price. The offer still existed," Margaret said. "I wanted an independent technical opinion. Then why did you contact him through a private number rather than the review committee? Richard looked toward his attorney. Evelyn continued before he answered. The laboratory repeated the central performance tests. Carter Beacon met the requirements in its original certification. The fire department confirmed its approval of the supervised deployment plan. The claims of stolen technology and fabricated testing are unsupported. Annie had imagined hearing those words for weeks. When they came, she felt no triumph. Only the release of pressure she had carried so long that she had stopped noticing its full weight. Margaret looked at her. Miss Carter, do you wish to respond? Annie stood, only to clarify one thing. She glanced toward Richard. I never claimed I created Carter Beacon without help. Engineers corrected me. The laboratory rejected early versions. Helen Brooks made me repeat tests I thought I had already passed. That is not evidence that the work was stolen. It is evidence that the work was examined. She turned back to the board. If Mr. Hale had opened the files, he would have known that. Anya sat down. Richard's attorney asked for a short recess. Margaret denied the request. We have addressed the technical questions, the contracting process, and the alleged conflict of interest, she said. Unless counsel has further evidence concerning Miss Carter's qualifications, we will proceed. Richard's attorney looked down at his notes. Not at this time. Evelyn returned to her table and picked up a thick folder Annie had not seen before. Its label read Creston Safety Services, Financial Review. Richard saw it. The movement of his hands stopped. Evelyn placed the folder before the committee. The allegations against Annie Carter have now been examined, she said. The remaining evidence concerns why Richard Hale was so determined to prevent her maintenance system from reaching the board. She opened the file. This part is about money. Evelyn removed the first document from the Creston file and placed it beneath the camera above the table. An invoice appeared on the screen. Creston Safety Services billed Whitmore Residential Group for 32 battery replacements at Jefferson Courts on November 9th, she said. The work order was approved and paid. She displayed a photograph from the Carter Beacon pilot 3 weeks later. A technician held one of the existing batteries beside its printed manufacturing date. 26 of those units still contained batteries more than 2 years old. Richard leaned toward his microphone. That does not prove Creston failed to replace them. Old inventory may have been used. Dr. Lynn answered from the screen. Possible, but unlikely. It would also violate Creston's own installation policy. Evelyn showed the next record. At Franklin Terrace, the same technician account reported inspections at 3 separate buildings at 10:14 inches the morning. A board member frowned. 3 technicians could have shared the account. That would violate the verification rules used to justify Creston's contract renewal, Maya said. Richard looked at her. You are not an auditor. No, Maya replied. I am the analyst who processed the renewal documents. Evelyn presented 12 more invoices. The same patterns repeated. Identical timestamps, copied signatures, missing serial numbers and equipment, listed as active after residents had reported it disconnected. These records do not prove every service was fraudulent, she said. They establish enough inconsistency to require examination. Richard Hale attempted to prevent that examination. The screen changed to a contract renewal exemption signed by Richard when he was Chief Operating Officer. It argued that replacing Creston would create an unacceptable risk to residents. Margaret Ellis read the paragraph silently. Creston's contract was renewed without competitive bidding? Twice, Evelyn said. Who approved the exemptions? Mr. Hale. Richard sat straighter. Creston had institutional knowledge of the properties. Changing vendors would have created delays. Yet you attempted to replace Carter's safe signal with Creston after Carter ranked 14 points higher, Margaret said. Carter had no large-scale operating history. The technical panel accounted for that. The panel did not carry executive responsibility. Evelyn placed another document on the screen. The board also did not receive information about Northbridge Consulting. The name appeared above a schedule of payments. Each amount remained below the level requiring separate board approval. Richard's attorney rose. Northbridge provided legitimate consulting services to Creston. What services? Margaret asked. Richard answered before his attorney could. Operational analysis, vendor strategy, and regional cost assessment. Where are the reports? Richard paused. Creston retained Northbridge, not Whitmore. Evelyn displayed Northbridge's corporate registration. Northbridge Consulting is owned by Evan Hale, Richard Hale's brother-in-law. Several board members turned toward Richard. He remained still. My relationship with Mr. Hale did not influence Creston's selection. Did you disclose it? Margaret asked. I did not consider the relationship material. Your brother-in-law received more than $600,000 from a vendor whose contracts you repeatedly renewed. Over several years. That does not make it less material. Evelyn displayed an email from Richard to accounts payable. Divide future consulting reimbursements across monthly service categories. Individual amounts should remain below secondary review thresholds. Charles Bennett removed his glasses. You instructed accounting to structure the payments, so the board would not see them. I instructed them to process recurring expenses efficiently. Maya opened her laptop. There were no recurring expense codes for Northbridge until Mr. Hale requested them. Richard's attorney whispered something to him, but Richard pushed the microphone closer. This company manages thousands of units. Executives make decisions every day without placing each one before the board. That is not corruption, it is management. Evelyn turned to the final email. The message was dated 2 days before Annie's contract meeting. If Carter Beacon is approved, its maintenance archive will invite unnecessary review of historical vendor records. Remove Appendix D and delay authorization until we establish control of the data. The sender was Richard Hale. The recipient was Evan Hale. No one spoke. Richard looked around the table. Historical data without context can damage the company and frighten residents. Margaret's voice remained level. You were not protecting residents. You were protecting the absence of a record. That is an interpretation. It is your email. Richard's composure finally slipped. You are allowing an 18-year-old contractor to dictate corporate policy because the chairman calls her his daughter. Thomas did not move from the second row. Annie stood. No, she said. The records are dictating what happened. Richard turned toward her. You do not understand what it takes to keep an organization this size functioning. I understand that you saw my face before you saw my work. You were unprepared for the scale of the project. I brought 4 binders you refused to open. You had the protection of Thomas Whitmore from the beginning. Annie looked toward Thomas. He remained silent, as he had promised. Yes, she said. I had a father who gave me a stable home. I had Helen, engineers, laboratory staff, and people who corrected my mistakes. I had more help than many young women receive. Richard appeared surprised by the admission. Annie continued. But help did not write the software. Help did not complete the tests. Help did not place my company first in an anonymous review. She turned to the board. I had evidence, legal counsel, and a father powerful enough to make this room listen after the contract was torn. The people who came before me may have had none of those things. Margaret asked, What outcome are you requesting, Miss Carter? I want the contract restored because it earned the highest score, not because Thomas is my father. She opened the deployment list. I want the original 312 buildings preserved. I want Maya and every employee who cooperated with this investigation protected from retaliation. I want every maintenance contract Mr. Hale influenced independently audited. Evelyn continued writing. I want residents to receive a plain language report explaining what was found. Their homes created these invoices. They should not be the last people told what happened, Charles asked. And the financial recovery? Any money legally recovered from Creston, Northbridge, or related penalties should fund free Carter Beacon installations in low-income buildings that were not included in the original contract. A board member leaned forward. You understand those funds could become company property. I understand. I'm asking the company to choose what kind of property they become. Margaret looked toward Richard. Do you have a response? His attorney placed a hand over the microphone. After a short exchange, Richard leaned back and said nothing. The committee recessed for 20 minutes. No one left the floor. When the board returned, Margaret read the decisions into the record. Richard was suspended immediately, his access revoked, and the financial evidence referred to the appropriate authorities. Creston's work was halted pending inspection. Carter Safe Signals' contract was restored under independent oversight. Maya received formal whistleblower protection. A resident advisory panel would be added to the deployment program, and recovered funds would be directed into a community safety fund after legal review. Thomas did not applaud. Neither did Annie. The silence held something more useful than celebration. Acknowledgement. Security waited outside the boardroom as Richard collected his papers. He passed Annie without looking at her. At the door, Margaret stopped him. Mr. Hale, leave the company files. He looked down at the folder in his hand, then placed it on the table. A month earlier, he had decided which documents mattered and which people deserved to be heard. Now he left without either authority. Annie looked at the deployment list before closing it. Jefferson Courts remained first. Winning the contract was no longer enough. The next task was making certain the people behind those addresses finally received what the contract had promised. Richard Hale's suspension became permanent 12 days after the board hearing. Whitmore Residential Group issued a public statement confirming that his employment had been terminated following an independent investigation into contracting practices, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and retaliation against employees. The financial records involving Creston Safety Services and Northbridge Consulting were transferred to the appropriate authorities. The company also began legal proceedings to recover payments that could not be supported by completed work. The statement did not mention Annie's race. It did not mention the contract being torn. Annie noticed both omissions. So they corrected the accounting and removed the human being from the story, she said. Evelyn Parker closed the printed statement. They were sitting in a small conference room at Carter Safe Signal's temporary office in West Philadelphia. They wrote the safest version their attorneys would approve. Safe for whom? For the company. Annie looked toward the window. The residents should receive more than this. They will. The board approved a separate plain language report for every affected property. It will explain which records are being reviewed, what inspections will occur, and how residents can report concerns. Will Richard's name be in it? If the facts require it. They do. Evelyn studied her. Accountability does not always arrive in the sentence we want. Sometimes it arrives in access being revoked, money being recovered, and a person no longer having the authority to repeat what they did. That sounds less satisfying. It usually is. Annie folded the statement and placed it beside Daniel's notebook. Justice isn't fairness arriving on time, she said. Evelyn nodded. It is someone refusing to let unfairness write the final line. The restored contract included independent oversight, quarterly reporting, and a resident advisory panel. Thomas would receive the same public updates as the rest of the board. He would not vote on Carter Safe Signal matters or participate in negotiations. The $5 million deployment still covered 312 buildings. Payments would be released by project stage rather than as one sum, and licensed contractors would complete every installation under city-approved plans. The Carter Community Safety Fund was established separately. It would receive recovered vendor payments, contractual penalties, and voluntary contributions. Annie refused Thomas's suggestion that he cover the initial balance himself. The fund cannot begin as another thing people say you bought for me, she told him. I would not be buying it for you. That won't stop them from saying it. Thomas started to argue, then stopped. What can I do? Help the board recover what was taken. After that, contribute under the same rules as everyone else. He did not like the answer, but he accepted it. Maya Rodriguez was offered a new position in procurement ethics. She read the job description twice before agreeing to discuss it. I don't want a promotion that exists because the company feels guilty, she told Evelyn. Then ask for authority, not a title. Maya did. She requested direct access to the board's compliance committee, protection for employees who reported interference, and written limits on executive changes to anonymous scoring. The board accepted most of her conditions and negotiated the rest. When she finally signed, Annie asked how it felt. Like signing something I actually wrote. Their first resident meeting took place at Jefferson Courts on a Thursday evening. The community room had folding chairs, 2 large coffee urns, and 3 boxes of donuts on a table beneath a bulletin board. Notices had been printed in English, Spanish, and Mandarin. Loretta Green sat in the front row wearing a red cardigan and the expression of someone who had attended too many meetings where executives promised improvements and disappeared. She was 68, a retired city bus driver and president of the resident council. Annie introduced herself, explained Carter Beacon in plain language, and finished by inviting questions. Loretta raised her hand first. Who changes the batteries? The property maintenance team, under a schedule that residents and inspectors can verify. And when the maintenance team says it changed them but didn't, the original service record remains visible. A correction can be added, but the first entry cannot be erased. What happens if the internet goes down? The alarms and visual signals continue working locally. My neighbor on the 6th floor doesn't hear well. The system includes visual alerts, and will meet with residents individually before installation to identify placement needs. Some people here don't use smartphones. They won't need one for the device inside the building. Loretta leaned back. Will the company raise our rent because it installed this? A property manager shifted in his chair. Annie looked toward him, then back at Loretta. The contract does not permit the installation cost to be passed to residents. That commitment will be included in the written program information. Loretta pointed at the property manager. I want him to say it too. The man cleared his throat. Installation costs will not be added to tenant rent. And maintenance? Also covered by the program. Loretta nodded. Put that in writing. We will, Annie said. After the meeting, Loretta approached her near the coffee table. You answered better than most people they send here. Because I had better answers? Because you said when you didn't control the answer. Loretta poured coffee into a foam cup. Don't come here expecting gratitude. We've had people put our faces in brochures and call it community engagement. I'm not asking anyone to be grateful. Good. Ask us whether the system works. I plan to. Loretta looked at her for a moment, then extended her hand. Annie stood straighter before accepting it, remembering Daniel's rule that a young person should always rise when greeting an elder. Then we'll work together, Miss Carter, Loretta said. That evening, Annie returned to Chestnut Hill and found Thomas warming tomato soup. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches rested in a skillet. You're burning one side, she said. I was waiting for expert supervision. You once built a national company. Buildings rarely require butter. They ate at the scratched wooden table near the kitchen window. For several minutes, neither mentioned the investigation. Then Thomas set down his spoon. I owe you an apology. For the sandwich? For believing protection meant standing in front of you. Annie looked at him. I saw those pages on the floor, he continued, and I wanted to remove Richard before he could speak another word. I know. I thought power was the fastest way to make things right. It would have made things quiet. That isn't the same. Thomas nodded. Sometimes protecting you means standing beside you and letting people hear you speak. Annie tore a corner from her sandwich. And sometimes I treat every offer of help like an attempt to take the work away from me. You had reasons. I still have to recognize when those reasons stop helping. Thomas reached toward a small tin box on the counter. Frank O'Donnell brought this by. Inside was an old brass locker tag stamped with Daniel Carter's name and department number. The edges had been worn smooth from years of use. Annie held it in her palm. Frank said your father kept it on the same ring for his entire career, Thomas said. He thought you should have it. Annie ran her thumb across the letters. The first free installation will be at Jefferson Courts, she said. I heard. I want Dad's name on the first Carter Beacon unit. Thomas did not answer immediately. As the inventor? He asked. Annie shook her head. As the reason I kept building after the first version failed. Thomas looked at the locker tag in her hand. He would have complained that the lettering was too large. He would have checked whether the device worked before reading the name. That too. Annie closed her fingers around the tag. For years, she had tried to protect Daniel's memory by refusing to let anyone place a price on what he had done. Now she understood that honoring him did not require keeping his name separate from everything that followed. It required telling the truth about his part in it. He had not designed Carter Beacon. He had taught Annie to notice the people systems were built without seeing. 6 months later, his name would appear on the first device installed through the community fund, not as the man who created it, but as the man who gave it a reason to exist. 6 months later, the community room at Jefferson Court smelled of coffee, baked meatloaf, and apple pie. Folding chairs filled the space between the bulletin board and a temporary platform built from 2 low risers. Children moved between adults carrying paper plates, while several older residents sat near the front where they could hear without straining. Nothing about the gathering looked like a corporate event. There were no velvet ropes, no oversized banners, and no professional photographs of executives shaking hands. A small American flag stood beside a poster explaining Carter Beacon in English, Spanish, and Mandarin. Another board listed the installation schedule for all 6 buildings in the complex. Loretta Green stood near the coffee urn, making certain no one from Whitmore Residential Group rearranged anything without asking her. The chairs stay where they are, she told a young event coordinator. Mrs. Wilkins needs room for her walker, and Mr. Bell hears better from the left side. The coordinator moved the chair back. Yes, ma'am. Annie watched from the doorway with Daniel's brass locker tag in her hand. Its edges had grown warm inside her palm. Helen Brooks approached carrying 2 paper cups. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Standing at the edge of the room as if you need permission to enter your own event. It isn't my event. Helen handed her a cup.
socialize.
Good answer. Still avoiding the point. Annie took a sip. Where's Thomas? Behind you. Thomas stood several feet away, speaking with Frank O'Donnell, the retired firefighter who had worked beside Daniel. Thomas wore a plain dark suit without a tie. Frank wore an old department jacket and held a small metal box beneath one arm. When Thomas noticed Annie looking, he did not walk over and take control. He only lifted his hand. "Beside you, not in front of you." Annie crossed the room to them. Frank studied her face for a moment. "You've got Danny's look." "What look?" "The one that made people admit things they hadn't planned to admit." Thomas nodded. "I have seen it." Frank opened the metal box. Inside lay Daniel's old identification badge, a folded photograph and a department patch faded around the edges. "I thought these should be here today," Frank said. "Not inside the device, just nearby." Annie touched the photograph. Daniel stood beside a table at a neighborhood safety meeting, one hand resting on a stack of translated instruction sheets. He was not looking at the camera. He was listening to an elderly woman beside him. "He hated posed pictures," Annie said. "He said photographs made people behave like their work was finished," Frank replied. Across the room, Maya Rodriguez spoke with two members of the new resident advisory panel. Her position in procurement ethics had become permanent, along with the protections she had demanded. Every change to anonymous scoring now required a written explanation, and no executive could remove technical material from a board packet without leaving an automatic notice. When Maya joined them, Annie noticed the signed identification badge clipped to her jacket. "How does it feel?" Annie asked. "What?" "Working somewhere that knows you keep records." Maya smiled. Quieter, the recovered funds from Creston and Northbridge had not arrived all at once. Some remained tied to legal proceedings, but enough had been returned to begin the first round of free installations. Whitmore Residential Group had added contractual penalties from the delayed project, and outside donors had contributed under the same published rules. Thomas had waited 3 months before making his donation. It had been listed without a special announcement. Loretta tapped a spoon against her coffee cup. "If everyone with a plate can sit down without spilling gravy on somebody, we're ready." The room settled. Loretta spoke first. She did not thank the company for giving residents something they deserved. Instead, she explained the agreement residents had negotiated. Installation costs would not affect rent. Maintenance records would remain available to the advisory panel, and every complaint would receive a tracking number. "We are not decorations in somebody else's success story," she said. "We live here. We know these buildings. This works because they finally asked us questions before making decisions." Then she introduced Maya, Helen, and the installation team. Thomas's name came after theirs. When Loretta called Annie forward, the applause was warm but brief. Annie preferred it that way. A Carter beacon unit rested inside a clear display case beside the platform. Its casing was white, with a narrow green light across the front. On the back, where residents would not see it every day but technicians would see it during every inspection, a name had been engraved: Daniel Carter. Below it were the words, "Not the man who built this device, but the man who gave it a reason to exist." Annie placed Daniel's locker tag beside the unit. "My father did not design Carter Beacon," she began. "He never wrote its software, selected its components, or tested its signal. He did something more important, long before I understood what it meant." She looked toward Frank. "He taught me to notice who was missing from the room when decisions were made." Annie told the residents how Daniel had returned from safety meetings with questions about older tenants, families who needed translated instructions in buildings where maintenance forms looked complete, even when residents said something had been ignored. He believed safety should not depend on how much money a family had or how much attention their address received, she said. "I built Carter Beacon because he taught me that a warning system should answer to the people living beside it." Thomas remained behind the last row of chairs. He did not step closer when Annie mentioned Daniel saving his life. That story was part of their family, but today did not belong to him. After Annie finished, a technician removed the unit from the case and carried it to the first-floor hallway. The residents followed in small groups. Loretta supervised the placement. "Not too high," she said. "People have to read the instructions without climbing a chair." The technician lowered it by 2 inches. A young girl with purple beads in her hair stood beside Annie. She could not have been older than 8. "Was your dad the inventor?" she asked. Annie knelt so they were at the same height. "No." The girl pointed toward Daniel's name. "Then why is he on it?" "He taught me why it needed to exist." The girl considered that answer. "Did he know you would make it?" I don't think so. Would he be proud? Annie looked at the unit, then at Frank holding Daniel's photograph. I think he would test it first. The girl laughed. Then would he be proud? Then he might admit it. The technician completed the connection. A narrow green light appeared across the front of the Carter beacon. No sirens sounded. No emergency interrupted the room. The light simply remained steady, indicating that the unit was connected, active and ready to be checked whenever a resident or inspector needed proof. Back in the community room, another object waited on the wall. The pieces of the $5 million contract had been arranged inside a plain wooden frame. They had been placed close together, but no one had tried to hide the torn edges. Beneath them was a small metal plate. Paper can be torn. Truth, when protected, can still build a future. Richard Hale's name appeared nowhere. The frame did not exist to preserve his importance. It existed to remember what could happen when people mistook authority for truth and silence for agreement. Thomas came to stand beside Annie. You were right, he said. About what? Your father would have checked the device before reading his name. Annie smiled. He would have asked Loretta whether the maintenance instructions made sense. Then he would have corrected the grammar, even if it was already correct. They watched Maya explain the reporting system to a group of residents. Helen had cornered one of the engineers and was questioning the placement of a second unit. Frank stood beneath Daniel's photograph, telling two children that a person did not need to be famous for their work to continue after them. For years, Annie had thought keeping her father's memory meant holding tightly to what she had lost. Now, standing in a building Daniel had never entered, she understood something different. Memory was not something I had to carry backward. It was something I could build forward. The thought passed, and she returned to the room around her. Daniel's sacrifice was not a debt Thomas could repay. Thomas's love was not a favor Annie had to refuse. Maya's courage did not erase the days she had been afraid. Justice did not return the time the residents had spent waiting. None of those things could be made perfect. They could only be carried honestly into what came next. The green light remained steady on the wall. Behind glass, the contract still showed every tier. Daniel Carter's name remained whole. The story reminds us that true justice is not created by wealth, titles, or public attention, but by the courage to protect the truth when staying silent would be easier. Annie proves that accepting help does not erase personal achievement, while Thomas learns that real protection means standing beside someone rather than speaking over them. Most importantly, the story shows that prejudice can be challenged through evidence, integrity, and people willing to act. A good legacy is not measured by recognition or money, but by how one person's values continue to improve the lives of others. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.